Lesson 11.0 on solving proportions. To prepare for today's lesson, we need to go over a couple vocabulary terms, the first of which is ratios. A ratio is an expression comparing two quantities by division. For example, let's say that you were told that in a class of 18 students, 9 students are female. What ratio of students are female? You can solve this problem by just creating a ratio comparing the 9 female students to the 18 total students. And your ratio would be 9 to 18. Or a gear ratio. A typical first gear in a car's transmission joins a gear with radius of 2 to a gear with radius 8. What's the gear ratio between the set of gears? And the gear ratio would be 4 to 1. Now, when we have two ratios set equal to each other, then we have a proportion. For example, 4/8 equals 1/2. If you were to take 4 divided by 8 and 1 divided by 2 in a calculator, you would get the same value, 0.5. Therefore, these two ratios are equal, and then we have a proportion. Now, the crux of today's lessons is going to be in solving proportions. For example, in this proportion, we're given two ratios, but we don't know the value of the denominator in the second ratio. Now, our goal here is to find the value of the variable, which makes these two ratios equal in value. So, if 4/10 equals 14 divided by some number, how do we figure out the value of x? Our solution is we use a process called cross multiplication, where we multiply the first fraction's numerator with the second fraction's denominator, and the first fraction's denominator with the second fraction's numerator, and set these two products equal to each other. So, 4 times x equals 10 times 14, or 4x equals 140. Then we just solve this equation by dividing both sides by 4. X equals 140 divided by 4. X equals 35. Now, a word of caution. Cross multiplication is not a process that you can use with any equation that you see. It is only a process that works with proportions. If you have anything that is not quite a proportion, even there where you're adding 3 to another fraction, you cannot use cross multiplication. You must have a proportion with a ratio equal to a ratio. Now, to set up a proportion problem, it takes a little bit of craft and skill. In this example, Jack just finished the first page on a multiple choice test, and he thinks he got about 8 out of the first 10 questions correct. If the test has a total of 45 questions, how many can he expect to get correct? In order to set up this proportion correctly, we must first plan our ratio. In this problem, we're comparing two distinct objects. The first one is the number of questions he gets correct, and the second is the total number of questions answered. We need to define and clarify this ratio if we are to set up a proportion correctly. But once we have this plan in place, then our proportion will go relatively smoothly. So let's create a proportion. Two ratios set equal to each other. In the first ratio, Jack thinks he got 8 questions correct out of total of 10 questions answered. So there's our first ratio. In our second proportion, we know that the test has a total of 45 questions. We don't know how many he thinks he got correct. So 45 will go in the denominator, and the variable x will go in the numerator. Now that we have our proportion, step 3 is just cross multiplying to solve. So 8 times 45 equals 10 times x. Create our equation by cross multiplying. 10x equals 8 times 45. Divide both sides by 10, and we get x equals 36. And be sure that you finish the problem by actually saying what it is you're counting, because it is a word problem. So if he has 45 total questions, he can expect to get 36 questions correct. Thus concludes today's lesson.